For 46 states, July marks the start of the fiscal new year. On this episode of Breakdown, Alex Jonathan Williams and Lee Schalk discuss what to expect now as the post-pandemic boom years for state budgets fade away and states committed to fiscal responsibility find themselves in a much stronger position.
Well, Jonathan, there's a lot going on in the state policy space right now, but today we're celebrating the new fiscal new year for many states, 46 states this week, starting their new fiscal year. And what does that mean for those who may not be familiar with the term or the fact that July marks that for 46 states?
Well, you're right. Happy fiscal new year to all of you, at least the 46 states that celebrate. And what it is the start of a new budget season. It's the end of closing out of the budget season. Instead of doing it on January 1st, let's say, for most businesses, or at least a lot of businesses, and a lot of tax filing deadlines obviously revolve around January 1st for new income tax year, at least over course of history, many states decided that July 1st would be the date of their new fiscal year or new budget year. And so generally it means that the states that are still in session towards the end of the spring and early summer in June are cramming in the deadline to make sure that they have a budget in place by that deadline of June 30th. And then there's a few laggards that are out there that haven't quite got across the finish line that are still wrangling in these days of July. So it's a kind of an ending of one year, starting of another, and lots of really interesting things that go on either side of that.
Well, I want to get to a handful of states that may have a difficult situation right now as revenues are flattening or falling, and maybe some states that are in a good position right now. But before we get there, let's go back a couple of years to the COVID years, the pandemic, and what states were experiencing, which has led up to the current situation.
Well, it's a great point because, right now, as you referenced, state, revenues are flattening in many cases, some coming in just below average, some coming in a little bit above still. But I mean, over the last 3 years coming out of the pandemics and the reopening of the economy, we saw states sitting at really 50-year surplus highs in aggregate. So we saw so much money sloshing around state capitals, as we've talked about, whether it was the actual revenue gains from the states or whether it was all the federal dollars into state capitals. States were sitting on a lot of money, which did things like pad rainy day funds, which could be, helpful. It did a lot of things like set off the tax cut resolution that we've talked about, with 22 states over the last 3 years prior to 2024 cutting personal income tax rates. But it also, as a fiscal conservative, as somebody who believes in fiscal responsibility, these have been challenging years because it's meant that states have ramped up state spending at the very same time. If the money's sitting there, as we often say in the state capitals, state legislators, there's a big temptation to just go and spend it. And so all of that confluence of factors kind of led us to where we're at today. But now we're getting back to this scenario where we're really at a new normal, back to normal, in a scenario where we are flatlining a little bit on revenue. And we're seeing a situation now where legislators, for the first time in several legislative sessions, are needing to decide what every family and what every business has to decide every month. And that is, what does it need and what does it want? We don't have everything we want, so we have to do the thing called economize, right? And get back to budgeting 101.
Yeah, I mean, over the last couple of years, to your point, it was amazing to see those 22 states cut personal income tax rates. Of course, the state flat tax revolution also took place with 5 states flattening their income taxes. And that was really unprecedented, something we haven't seen before in history. But there were also a lot of states that sort of followed the pattern of Washington to go on a tax and spend binge, even as revenues came in. And of course, our members led the charge, the leading voice amplified in Washington to say, no state bailouts or no federal bailout of state governments who were really flush with cash. But getting back to where we are today, so revenues flattening out, sort of a return to normal. What are some of the states who find themselves in kind of a dicey predicament right now?
Well, California, right? I mean, as a case study generally and what not to do as a state is don't replicate California. And California went from Gavin Newsom as governor going around the country saying, look, at progressive governance works. We have a $100 billion surplus just about a year ago, to fast forward to this last January, where the revenue estimates came in so horribly for California that they're really in a debate over how big the deficit is. But it's a major deficit. maybe upwards of $70 billion in a budget shortfall for California after a $100 billion surplus reported a year ago. So a major turnaround of events. And one of the reasons why, as we often point out in rich states, poor states, is states like California, critically a poor state, clearly in our analysis of the states, a state that overly relies on progressive income taxes, over relies on business income taxes to get their revenue. And so when times are good, times are really good in places like California, but when times are bad, states face major shortfalls, and California is usually one of the most extreme because of this over-reliance on volatile sources of revenue like income taxes.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen kind of a really bad snowball effect in California. The California exodus, a term that we use often, but even the LA Times has acknowledged and used themselves, as millions have fled the state in search of greener pastures, but really in search of economic opportunity. And so there are a lot of states that have gained residents, but we see that taxpayers voting with their feet to places like Texas or Florida, but really any of the states surrounding California have seen an influx. What other states are kind of in a tight spot right now? Because obviously there are a couple of approaches when spending flattens out. Some of these states that often rank in the bottom 5 or 10 of rich states, poor states, they double down and they pursue higher taxes. What other states are kind of setting the wrong example right now?
Well, there's a few that fall into that category. And to be fair to California, they have done some things like some belt tightening and used some of those surplus dollars and rainy day funds and draw those down. And so the good news is California didn't do a dramatic, vicious cycle where they're going to raise taxes even further quite yet. Now, don't hold your breath. I think they're going to give them some time and they're going to come up with a way to raise more taxes in California because they want this government growth to continue. But, you mentioned what are the other states in this vicious cycle, like Illinois, for instance, another state that's seen hundreds of thousands of Americans vote with their feet and leave the state because of high taxes. Then, surprise, surprise, they have another budget shortfall this year. And what do? They go back to the same failed strategy again and raise taxes more on businesses, on property. And then even for those that enjoy sports gaming that's newly legalized because of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling several years ago, they enacted one of the nation's biggest tax burdens on sports gaming. So over $1 billion of new taxes for a state where their taxpayers have already been beleaguered. You look at Maryland, another example of a state that has raised taxes far too many times in recent years, probably more taxes coming for transportation and education. New Jersey, a state that Governor Murphy, in the midst of the pandemic, really the only governor to go for a major broad-based tax increase during 2020, 2021, back at it again with more tax increase proposals. So some of these poor states in our analysis just keep digging the hole deeper by making this problem worse.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about the taxes on gaming. It's a good example, or really a bad example, of these discriminatory taxes that, it's not always on the income tax side, which those are obviously a huge threat to economic growth, but states often pursue these bad policies, imposing higher discriminatory taxes and really muddying up their tax code and hurting their overall economic outlook. One of the states that we were talking about earlier that is kind of a bright spot right now is Florida. And when it comes to budgeting and spending, I think there's such a great contrast and divide between Florida and New York. Historically, or in recent years, have had roughly the same population size, about 20 million people. But New York has a budget that is generally twice the size of Florida's. And of course, Florida manages to do this with no personal income tax. What's the current situation in Florida? Are they continuing sort of that positive trend as we think about the new fiscal year and getting spending under control?
Well, Florida, the free state of Florida has done just amazing work over the number of years now, and they did not stop this year. In fact, they're one of the shiniest objects of a state to do the right thing when it comes to this budget year, where incredibly, this is almost unfathomable for people to think about, but Florida reduced actual spending this year in the budget just signed into law several weeks ago by Governor DeSantis, where I think it was $500 million net reduction in the state budget versus what it was last year. That's in addition to multi-billion-dollar tax cut, as well as I think it was over $6 billion of paying down more debt that the state had on the books. So Florida's at a scenario now where at their lowest debt level in 25 years. They're continuing to right-size government as revenues flatline in some cases. And then they're they're looking at ways to continue to cut taxes all at the same time. So it's the great marriage of good policy that we talk about often at ALEC here, which is you cut spending, you become more efficient as a government, and that gives you more resources to cut taxes without racking up any kind of a deficit.
I mean, it's really amazing to think about in 2024, we have a state that's cutting spending significantly and paying down debt. Of course, inflation is affecting all of us, but for state governments, that is really an accomplishment to cut spending. You think about, too, the federal dollars that flow into states often drive spending higher. And so the budget cycle each year, I think we're stuck in this terrible status quo, business as usual, of just padding last year's budget, accounting for inflation, accounting for caseload increases, accounting for those strings attached to federal dollars. So that is just an incredible bright spot as we look at the new fiscal year.
It is, and it's such a great point. Our budget reform toolkit that we talk about often here at ALEC that we developed coming out of the financial crisis gets to some of those basics of how states get back to basic now that we're in this scenario we don't have all the money we want. And I know our good friend Seth Grove, who's the Republican lead on appropriations in the Pennsylvania House, has been working late hours to make sure that Pennsylvania gets down to more of a reality-based budget. So you could roll the clip of Representative Grove.
So we basically do incremental budgeting here, which means regardless of how well a program works, whether it works, whether you need more money, don't need more money, we just add money to every single line every single year. What that leads to is this ingrained thought that that's how much people need every single year and everything's working great. To me, it's very lazy budgeting. You're just throwing money on top of it without any discussion on if it works and is benefit to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the citizens. So it's not new, but it's something other governments have done to great success, and that is zero-based budgeting, where you take every line down to zero and then you rebuild it from there up. And you get to ask the questions, has this worked? Does this program actually need more money? Because it is working and it is underfunded. So if you take it down to zero, we have all these robust reports we can actually dust off, and we can look at the performance of these programs, see how they work, and have those deep. I mean, legislators ask for stuff in budgets. There's a lot of legislators that haven't been here anymore in the past 30 years. Did the legislators ask for a line item in 1980? Do we need that today in 2024?
And as Representative Grove outlines there, it's really basic budgeting 101 is just you can't take last year's budget and as a starting point and then just argue over whether it's going to be a 7% growth or a 9% growth. That doesn't get you any efficiency. It doesn't ask the question of whether a government program has been there for 30 or 40 or 50 years. Should you continue doing it whatsoever? And just getting back to the best of what businesses and the kind of key questions that they have to go through. And this is something that we've talked about for years at ALEC based on priorities of government. Our great late friend Bob Williams, who was a Washington state legislator and talked nonstop at ALEC, every single person that would listen to Bob, he would talk to about how do you go from budgeting as usual, that incremental budgeting that Rep. Grove just pointed out doesn't work, to a priority-based budget that every family and every business has to go through every year.
Yeah, the budget reform toolkit, I think, stresses those sound principles of budgeting. And it's something that every American family has to deal with at their kitchen table. You wouldn't keep spending money in a way that wasn't being effective or utilizing these dollars wisely. How can legislators be better stewards of these taxpayer dollars? And for any ALEC member who's been around for some time, you've been to our academies or our task force meetings, you've heard all about these spending priorities, or sound budgeting principles. What are some other ways that legislators can start to rethink that budgeting process and how to better steward Americans' taxpayer dollars?
Well, that's right. I mean, avoid the problems that we see here in Washington, D.C. And I mean, if we were to summarize up kind of this discussion around budget best practices and around fiscal best practices in general, you can really summarize rich states, poor states, and our budget work down into a very brief summary is, look for ways to be more like Florida and less like California. I think that debate between Governor DeSantis and Governor Newsom was awfully telling to say, here are two of America's biggest states. radically different views in how they go about providing government services, how they go about taxing, how they go about just the outlook as a government. And we can see people vote with their feet. The proof is in the pudding, as we often say here at ALEC. Americans like freedom when given the opportunity.
Yeah, and there have been a number of states that have really taken a hard look at their tax codes, their spending over recent years. We've tracked it in many editions of Rich States, Poor States, and we've seen some big movers and shakers, over the past 16, 17 years of the report. What are some other states that are on the rise right now?
Well, I mean, Utah's been at number one for all 17 editions of Rich States, Poor States. And it's really this virtuous mix of spending control and prudent budgeting and reanalyzing ways that they've done things before, not always just doing the same thing over and over again, innovating, and then finding ways to continue to reduce tax burdens at the same time. I mean, this is, back to what Art Laffer always likes to say, this isn't rocket surgery. This is basic 101 of economics and of budgeting. You have to be prudent first on the spending side, so you don't really get into a situation where states have gotten too aggressive and they've raised spending and they've raised, they've cut taxes and raised spending. It doesn't work out that way. So when you look at a state like Utah, a state that is even analyzed, as we've talked about in ALEC model policy, the federal funds coming into their state, and they've said, hey, is this good for Utah? Do we need to accept all these federal funds? What is it going to cost us? And then, in this era now of nearly $35 trillion of national debt, what happens if the federal government takes away the aid to the states? What happens to these states that are signing themselves up for Medicaid expansion under the so-called Affordable Care Act, Obamacare? And now you have states where you have 50% of their all funds budget coming from the federal government. I mean, that's a shocker for a lot of people. And states like Utah that have been able to stay ahead of the curve, they've always looked around the corner to say, what happens when that federal aid to the state stops? And that would be a major awakening, right, for the states going forward if that happens.
Yeah, and of course you're referring to Utah's Financial Ready plan that has been just a huge, just a godsend for the state of Utah, because to your point, the way that things are going here in Washington, there seems to be no appetite for really reining in federal spending. And so what happens when the rug gets pulled out from under these states, those federal dollars go away, and all of a sudden state taxpayers are on the hook to keep the spending going.
And that's one of the reasons the bond rating agencies continue to give Utah a AAA bond rating, is they say not only are they fiscally prudent on the spending side and the tax side, but they actually have a plan in place of what they will do when the federal government, or if the federal government, probably likely when the federal government reduces aid to the states. So that's a key attribute of, I think, Utah's long-term success.
Well, to tie a nice bow around the new fiscal year, final thoughts, final words of wisdom. What should legislators be thinking about as we get going here in July?
Well, spending equals taxation. And if we want to continue down the road of making our states more competitive, this tax revolution, this tax cut revolution, the flat tax revolution that we're seeing across the states, now is the time to make those decisions on the spending side of the equation. There's lots of great examples, whether it was the priorities of government we talked about based on Washington State's example, which is a key element of our budget reform toolkit that everyone should take a look at, refamiliarize yourself with, or if it's something like Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, a ALEC model policy now on the books for more than 30 years in Colorado, limiting the growth of government spending to the growth of the private sector. Kind of a basic concept, but it's worked wonders in a state like Colorado. So as always, ALEC has got trusted policy solutions as legislators look to really confront this new normal, getting back to the basics of deciding what needs versus wants are and not having all the money there as we have over the last 3 years.
That's right. States can fall behind by standing still on policy, on economic policy. Taxpayers will vote with their feet. And I would say for any state legislator who hasn't downloaded a copy of our state budget reform toolkit or Rich States, Poor States, do that as soon as possible. Also, look at our essential policy solutions with ideas across all of our 10 task forces on how to make your states more competitive.